Hey guys, welcome to the i5 podcast. I'm here with my co-host Jim,
Hello.
and we're basically going to discuss what's been going on in the news for a while. We are going to do something on the Deems Aham way as well, but for now we're going to cover really what is a historical topic, the deployment of NATO tanks in Ukraine, and potentially by the end of February, we'll go into that later on today, we might see NATO tanks actually engaging Russian modern military. But that's skipping ahead. Jim, how you doing?
Yeah, all right. It's definitely interesting development in regards to this whole Ukraine war, which, to be honest, I'm surprised it has dragged for that long.
Yeah.
And I believe even though this has caused severe consequences in the global economy, I think on the back of it there is also people who are profiting.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, that's a different topic altogether, a whole different kind of worms. But today we would like to focus on the development in regards to ammunition supplies, let's say, for aiding Ukraine.
We can touch on that slightly later on.
Yeah.
The economic aspect, just because there's a chance this could go wrong for the NATO powers. This could go wrong for the US, Germany, Britain, and basically become a tank grinder, which would deteriorate the tank supplies, and arms companies would make loads of money building more tanks. But
yeah, the problem is the whole situation is so fragile at the moment. It's so difficult to say anything accurately.
Yep, it's all predictions.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep, so let's keep it, as you said, let's keep it simple and to the facts. So we'll go into actually what kicked all this off. Ukraine have been asking for lots of different things since last year. They're still asking for jets. Now they've got the tanks. Again, that's another topic. They've been asked. It started off with things like shoulder-mounted rockets, the NLAW, things like that, anti-aircraft rockets for the infantry, basically infantry upgrades with infantry transports being given. This was really just to allow Ukraine to be strong enough just stop the Russian military getting to Kyiv and demilitarizing the country and making the actual invasion costly for the Russians. Artillery was also donated to them to give them the ability to fight back. Even the Russians still have more of it, but that allowed them to harass Russian front lines, again to stay in the war. Zelensky made a speech to the allies, more of a plea, and I actually agree with him on this assessment, saying that time is of the essence and time favors the Russians. The longer this goes on, the more likely it is that Ukraine are going to lose, so they need the tanks now. I do agree with that assessment. They can't hold out forever with the current state of things. And just to get the ball rolling on it, Britain went first and donated 14 Challenger 2s to Ukraine, along with a lot of artillery pieces in an attempt to unlock armor going into Ukraine. At least publicly, that's the reason given. Later on, Britain claimed it was leading the charge. Really, the Challenger 2s, some of them were getting scrapped anyway in the wake of the Challenger 3 upgrades. They were going to get scrapped, but it's a good gesture, and Ukraine could use the tanks. However, the big story is Germany and the Leopards, and I think it's more Biden authorizing the 31 Abrams to be sent to Ukraine, as well as Poland saying they were just going to do it anyway in relation to sending their Leopards and starting to train Ukrainian crews. I think that's really what caused the German government to basically unlock the export license and then officially send Leopards over to Ukraine as well, or say they're going to do it if they're not already there. Do you think?
Yeah, I can see that happening. At this point, the way I see it is like everyone saw the opportunity to weaken Russia.
Yeah.
So the more this war drags on, the more of opportunity the other countries have to do it. But at the same time, this started also degrading the economy at the global level, not only because of the energy crisis, but because of the aid Ukraine requires. I know this may sound a bit odd and bad to say, but for Britain, because I live in Britain, you live in Britain,
Yep.
we have had countless strikes in regards to like the NHS sector not being paid properly.
Yeah.
Which is again another whole topic on its own.
Very much so.
The Royal Mail one, Not too long ago, we had like the train strikes. Mind you,
Yep.
okay, apart from the NHS, the other two are private companies. What I'm
Uh,
getting at is they are privatized, aren't they? As far as I'm aware.
Royal Mail and the trains are now privatized, but also just
Yeah,
to reinforce your evidence, teachers are on strike, uni lecturers are on strike, driving instructors are on strike.
yeah, exactly. And at the same time, we like the people are struggling to pay their bills. What
Mm,
I'm getting at is you have a massive economic problem in Britain which needs solving.
yeah.
And at the same time, you seem to invest a huge amount of resources to the war in Ukraine just to keep
Mm,
face, ignoring what's happening inside the country.
yeah.
So I believe this happens more or less to all the countries that aid the Ukraine, and the reason they do it is because they believe. This is again speculation from my part. I
Of
believe they
course.
see it as an investment. You know how an
Mm,
investment you give a large amount of money up front in
yeah.
hopes you get to see a return later on. I think that's the case here.
Yeah.
I believe that by investing this sort of money well, sorry, not money, resources in favor of Ukraine in the Ukraine versus Russia war, I believe by helping Ukraine win, if Ukraine wins, the loss from Russia will offset the global economy again, which will
Mm,
result in profit for the countries that stand in favor of Ukraine.
mm,
But then again, there's also other factors involved in between, other personal gains which might exist on the
mm,
background, which we're not aware. But I think that's the situation in general.
mm. Yeah, there's definitely some truth to that. If you look at what's happening in Ukraine with the amount of destroyed infrastructure, BlackRock and American companies already made a contract with Zelensky to actually rebuild Ukraine. So the vultures are already circling for those contracts for the work that'll need to be done in Ukraine to get it fully functional again. So there are
Mhm.
people who are wanting to make money out of this, PMCs as well, who obviously reinforce the tanks. I won't go too much into this, just some brief points. PMCs as well, that reinforced a lot of the European borders before the war actually started selling weapons. That was Biden's aid. He'll send arms companies in, and you can buy weapons from American arms companies like Lockheed and Raytheon. We actually covered that rather last podcast. I think we went into great detail actually about just how much money the PMCs were making. In relation to your point about the government using foreign policy to distract from domestic, yeah, Boris Johnson did nothing but that before he resigned. He was in Ukraine more than he was in the UK at one point. In fact, in an interview with Susanna Reid, he actually tried to get out of public spending, saying that we had to spend money on the Ukraine budget. She
And
didn't let
that's
him
the
get it.
thing. Sorry to interrupt, but what
Oh
does
no,
it
fine.
mean? We have to spend money. Who forces you? You're the prime minister.
He was just using it as a deflection. He didn't want to. He wanted to cut more public spending, and
I
he was
know,
just
but it's
using that.
so daft of an
Yeah,
excuse.
it was, and you can't say things like that because what will happen is it'll make spending in Ukraine even more unpopular.
Well, I think it's already quite unpopular.
About 50%
Uh,
approval at the minute.
yeah, and not to mention, I'm not sure how much of a public knowledge is that we're sending that amount of resources to Ukraine, like in terms of the tanks, I mean.
The tanks and the artillery's been sidelined, and the news companies are really focusing on the tanks, but the challenges have already been shoved to the side, and the news stories are mainly focusing on the Leopards now, and the Abrams, of course, because it's the American Abrams.
Right. So, what's the deal with the leopards? Why is it such a big controversy?
Well, basically, the Germans haven't really commented until about a week ago. After a month of deliberation, that's when they authorised the re-export of the Leopard 2 tank over to Ukraine. Again, it holds the export licence for them. Before Poland just said, oh, well, we're going to send them anyway in Germany, which the German government just went, alright. It was really up to them, so that's why all the focus was on them. The controversy was the very idea that it's an escalation, sending tanks over. Not Soviet-era tanks, the fact that supposedly we're sending actual modern tanks over to Ukraine, and the controversy was how it might provoke the Russians. Domestically, which we'll get into a bit later, it's also a big move away from the German government's traditional model of what German culture actually is. The German government's always wanted to be part of an international task force when it intervenes in countries aggressively. So, for example, Afghanistan, Iraq. It was part of the coalition, or it was part of NATO. It liked that responsibility of, oh no, it's not just us doing this, we're part of an international task force, so it's okay. They always liked the idea of working with others who would take the main flak. A lot of people to this day don't even realize that Germany was in Afghanistan or Iraq.
That is true. I mean, even I wasn't aware of this
Mm,
up until quite recently.
yeah. So they like to, they're not ashamed of it, but they like to keep it quiet. Their World War II history always plays on their mind. Obviously, the idea of German tanks going back into Russian territory. I know Ukraine's not Russian territory, but they fought the Russians in Ukraine in World War II. So both in Ukraine and in Russian territory, what it is now. We are going to go into this in a lot more detail a bit later on, and we do actually address those arguments. But that was also another one. Scholz himself on February the 27th had really what was a radical speech in terms of how far it deviated from the norms, the cultural norms of German military culture. They tend to they tended to prioritize negotiation over everything else, and they became pacified to the point where it's quite detrimental to their national security. Their military's become very underfunded, very poorly maintained. Some of the money that actually went to their military, it didn't so much go to hardware, it went to pensions and officers and, other things like that. It's not really went to the hardware, the tanks, the submarines, the ships, the weapons. And a lot of the Leopards they have, they're not really that uniform with with the equipment they have and the upgrades they have. So their army, under this policy for really since World War II, well, as I say, I've said it, it's just been left to go to ruin. I mean, obviously they've got functioning tanks. They're not that bad. But Scholz, in his speech on February the 27th, who's the Chancellor, he increased defence spending to the NATO requirement of 2% of the GDP from 1.5 in 2021. He actually established a €100 billion euro fund for the German army. Mind you, it depends on how they spend that. They don't have a good track record of investing the actual money wisely. He's also agreed with the French to build more combat jets, and he also wants to equip the German army with drones to replace the aging Tornado planes. Furthermore, in the speech, he actually threw some shade, added some salt. He took a jab at the culture of prioritizing negotiation over everything else as well. So, crucial speech of wanting to move away from that culture of pacifism, if you want to call it that, wanting to stay out of international wars, that kind of thing. So it was quite interesting. It's quite a turning. That speech, I wonder if it'll be a turning point.
You mean a turning point in regards to how everyone's viewing sending supplies to Ukraine, or the whole war, or the involvement?
Just Germany's attitude towards how it intervenes militarily.
Yeah. The thing is, it was like a pretend game up until this point, because in the sense, not only in that aspect, but Europe in general, Europe is effectively Germany. Like, there's no denying that.
It's one of the stronger economies. So yeah, I'll admit that it is one of the stronger economies.
I would say it is the strongest, maybe not the strongest, but it is the most influential one. Like, every major decision has to go through Germany.
Yeah.
Germany already had that big of a role in Europe, but when war erupts in their territory, I mean, Europe is Germany's territory, they would expect Germany to react and take, some sort of lead, because if you're a lead under the table in regards to economy and all the major decisions, you should also take the lead and resolve this as best as possible, because it's part of your position, you know what I mean? So I don't believe the position of being a pacifist would be an option for Germany in the long run. Like, one way or the other, Germany would have to do something.
I mean, I agree. They have the potential to be a big military, and right now, both NATO and the EU, and they have legislation requirements for them to, like the 2% GDP investment in defense. They are required to have a military as part of NATO, which they haven't been really doing. And they're not the only ones. The UK has recently lowered its military standards massively over the past 12 years of the Tories, where we've been relegated from a tier 1 military, and the British military has also said that it can't defend the country. Just to explain how bad this has gotten, if we were invaded, the army would run out of ammunition in 2 days. And to add to what you were saying about the state of the economy, we've actually been predicted by the IMF today, 31st of January, that we're going to be the worst hit economy, and we're going to go into recession.
Well, shit.
Yep. So, sorry to inject that so late in, but it backs up the point you were saying earlier.
Yeah. Interesting times to live in.
Yep. So yeah, there was a lot of expectation on Germany, to be honest, because it's one of the bigger powers in Europe, and it's got the production output to be able to produce a strong military. Like I said, it's just they've been pacified for so long, it's deteriorated. Just to go into what's actually being donated and what's expected to be donated. So there are three models of Leopard. Forgive me. There's the A4 Leopard, which is the one from 1979, I believe, that was used in the 80s. So it's pretty dated. Still a good tank, and to be quite frank, better than what the Russians, currently have. They're using Soviet-era technology, especially in Ukraine, but the Russians have some modern tanks. It's still a match for them, but it's very dated. There's the A6, which is slightly more advanced, and you've got the A7, which is the latest generation of it. So those are the three: the Leopard A4, the Leopard A6, the Leopard A7. Here's what's being donated. We already know about the Challenger 2s and the Abrams from America. Germany are giving 14 Leopard 2 A6s from the early 2000s, so they're getting the mid-stage model. Poland are expected to give 14 models of the Leopard 2A4s from the 80s. Canada, 4 Leopard 2A4s. Spain, potentially 22 Leopard A4s. Norway, potentially 8 Leopard 2A4s. Portugal, upping the game, offering potentially 4 of the Leopard A6. Denmark is trying to take the initiative, offering to send 6 of the A7s. Even Germany's not willing to do that one. That is if they do it. This is all potential. And Holland are saying that they're going to send all 18 of their A6s. But I'd have to look into this, but Holland actually rent their tanks from Germany. So it's still German tanks being sent, it's just Holland have the rental contracts. So these added up make it potentially 88 Leopards. Variations of the models, 88 Leopards could be sent to Ukraine along with the 14 Challenger 2s and the 31 Abrams.
I may be oversimplifying things, but doesn't this sound like a World War III with extra steps? I mean, we have Ukraine versus Russia, and everybody else pretty much helps Ukraine.
That's what's frightening about it.
And it's like, where all this comes from? I mean, surely at this point, I just can't believe it's all because everyone feels so humanitarian towards Ukraine and they're eager to help.
I think there's a belief that Ukraine has to hold and can't be allowed to fall because Putin might move into Europe. I don't know if he would or he won't, but I do respect Ukraine's right to be independent.
Yeah, that makes sense, but at the same time, all Putin wanted was not to be surrounded by NATO.
Yeah, that's the big debate. But it's the debate no one's having.
Yeah.
Admittedly, Times Radio have asked this question, but I don't think they've hit it on the nose. But they did ask the question, and the journalist involved, I think it was McCann, she did ask it. And all she got was a lot of flack on YouTube for being pro-Russia when she wasn't. She was just asking a general question, the same one we'll ask now.
I mean,
is this just a regional conflict? Because this could spill over into Europe if we give all this equipment. If we give them jets, it could spill over into Europe. Right now, is Putin just not wanting,
what do you mean could? Zelensky is already using, marketing tactics, like trying to rush, Poland. Yeah, trying to rush everyone out to give help, and everyone is already talking and deciding what they're going to give. They already decide they're going to give help. It's just how much. You already have a list of the different model tanks they will potentially give, right? But since you know it, they most certainly know it as well. So it's not about what, it's about how much.
Yeah, I mean...
it's why I said earlier, it looks like a third world war with extra steps.
It does. I mean, a lot of people are saying to me they wouldn't be surprised if we get World War III in the next few years. I mean, I hope not, and I hope sensible heads prevail and they don't allow it to get to that point. But at the same time, I never thought I'd see the day where the NATO modern-day tanks would actually get sent over to Ukraine to fight the modern Soviet army. I never thought I'd see that scenario. So it's getting scary, and it seems to just be escalating and escalating. And, the big question is, Putin, from his perspective, he doesn't want to be surrounded by NATO, and are these just border disputes? It's a conundrum, and it's a complicated question, but people with more knowledge than us need to have these conversations, and it needs to be had in the public eye.
I mean, it started as a border dispute. I can believe that, but right now it's not just a border dispute.
It's war crimes.
There's a lot more stuff into it. You have the energy crisis in between. You have the border dispute. You have whatever NATO is trying to do with, including Ukraine. You have Russia trying to reclaim parts of Ukraine that were supposedly owned by the far right extremists or something. I can't remember the exact phrasing of how they phrased it.
They're flat out calling the Ukrainians Nazis. They're already referring to the Brown Chimera.
Okay. Yeah. At the same time, I heard Finland is trying to join NATO, and
They probably will.
It's either Finland or Norway.
It's Finland and Sweden.
Yeah, and at the same time, when this was the discussion, Russia was like, "Don't you dare fucking do it. We're gonna go and get you.
The
But
thing is,
it's like,
if Russia had just respected these countries' right to exist and not invaded Ukraine, Ukraine wouldn't be wanting to join NATO. England wouldn't be wanting to join NATO either. Putin has pressured them to do it.
I
From their
believe there are two
perspective,
sides on
oh
the
yeah,
story here. I do agree with what you say. Unfortunately, because of how things are, there is only one certain perspective being correct in regards to this whole war. So it's very difficult for me to investigate the other side of the story.
yeah,
But what I did want us to find out is that this whole Ukraine joining NATO, this was already planned, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, and
yeah. It's been
there was
discussed for a long time.
there was a specific interview which for some reason now it doesn't exist because I tried to find it.
Hmm.
That in that interview they knew that Russia would invade them in 2021.
Well, yeah, because they took the Crimea in 2014.
Yeah, so even from back then they knew that this would happen.
Hmm.
What I'm trying to get into is that this war has a lot more sides that we
Oh, very
haven't
much so.
explored and we are unable to explore due to the lack of knowledge
Hmm.
we have on the topic, and we can only get so much further,
I do.
unfortunately.
I do agree with that. And I do think in relation to this actual intervention, because we were going to get into this as well, I do think that they're trying to limit the intervention and basically make it so the Ukrainians can remove Russia from the Ukraine. And I think that's what might stop it going to World War III. This is not a significant number of tanks. This is basically a tank battalion. You've got the German government saying, sorry, that they could send an extra 56, and Spain could send an extra 33. I think Poland have said that they'd be willing to send some of their PT-21s and some more Leopards as well. Those still aren't epic numbers. That's basically enough for the Ukrainians to take some casualties and do their spring offensive and try and push the Russians back. So thankfully it's very limited. It's still a firm no on the jets. They will not give the Ukrainians any kind of air superiority. They'll not give them jets or anything like that. They're not taking air superiority away from the Russians.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that, but before that,
Hmm.
it's not about whether how much they're sending. It's the fact that everyone is pitching in, even if
Yeah,
it's just a little bit.
it's
But
it could just be
sorry, go on.
it could just be a NATO requirement.
Could be, yeah. And on the back of that is like, if you want a war, if you want the war to end, you could land and send jets to just make sure the war finishes quickly.
Oh yeah, but
And then there is that. But
mm,
as you said, they don't want. How did you phrase it? They don't want to remove Russia's air superiority
yeah, two
or
ways to
something like
phrase
that.
it. Two ways to phrase it. A no-fly zone, which would cancel out Russia's airstrikes and take away Russia's air superiority right now that they have. The Russians, as you say, they would not stand for that.
So wait a minute. Are you saying that as this war goes on, there is already a rule that says that the Russia isn't allowed to use any
Oh no,
air?
they're using planes. They've just been using them badly. Right now, their main attack tactic is to use Iranian drones to spot any Ukrainian vehicles they can, and then call in artillery strikes. The Russians, in response to this, have already been advertising their actual anti-tank planes, the Su-25. So when these tanks go into Russia, if they're not already there, they're going to be taking on these planes.
Okay, so up until now, you're saying that there hasn't been any flown aircrafts like.
Oh no, there has. There's been loads of airstrikes and missile strikes on civilian targets. The Russians have committed quite a few war crimes.
Okay, so what's the reason why the other countries don't want to give the jets to Ukraine? Is it because they don't want to strengthen the Ukraine's military, or is there any other reason
Yes,
why?
overstrength. It's the idea that Russia. We'll go into this a bit later, but Russia has two red lines. One is no NATO troops in Russia, and two, no invasion in Russia. That's what Putin said to prevent any kind of escalation with implied nuclear. So they don't want to overstrengthen, as you say, the Ukrainian military to the point where it could be inferred or deliberately misinterpreted that NATO are using Ukraine as a proxy military to strike into Russia and launch an invasion. That's why they wouldn't give
Right.
the Ukrainians the MLRs at the start, the ones with like 150-mile range, to prevent them from being able to fire into a Russian border. They just want to strengthen the Ukrainians enough to have a situation like Finland where they can repel the Russians for a while and make it so costly that the Russians don't want to do it, but they can also get them out of their country right now, and they can look after themselves. That's really all they want to do.
That makes sense. Yeah.
But as we were saying before, just with the escalation, also as well, just to make it clear as well, I'm not against Finland joining NATO. I fully understand why they want to do it, and I would probably, if we were in their position, we'd probably want to do it as well. Being on the border from Russia and you're watching what's happening to Ukraine, thinking that you're next. And the thing is, Putin has actually said that he has threatened to invade Finland and Sweden about a year ago.
Because Finland and Sweden, they were on about joining the NATO, so therefore Putin's reply was that we're going to invade you. And I know that for the fact because I have a friend there staying there, so he told me first. He told me firsthand that this actually happened.
Yeah,
because it was all over the news.
There was a balance. The Finnish and the Ukrainians and the other countries around the area just said, look, we'll not join NATO if you leave us the hell alone. And from their perspective, I know Putin has a perspective as well. There's perspectives everywhere, but from their perspective, you're a Swedish government minister, you're the Finnish prime minister, you're watching. Now, there's no need to join NATO, but then you see the Russians, who you thought you'd had an unspoken agreement with, invade Ukraine. You are going to think, yeah, we need NATO. Putin's not going to respect us. He's gone after Ukraine. What's to stop him going after us? And I can fully understand this. I can understand Putin not wanting to be surrounded by NATO states, but he's gone about this badly, especially with committing the war crimes. But like I said, we'll move on to the next one because we could go on about that all day. Though I do think, like I said, a lot of what you said was valid. Just before we move on, is there anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah. When is the next Russian election?
I have no idea. With Putin, probably never. So just the next topic.
Yeah.
We were discussing the escalation before. We'll just run through this quite quickly. The main thing they were given before, just to recap, NLAWs, the anti-tank rocket launcher, which was the big name that was floating around, Javelins and Stingers. The Javelins are very effective anti-tank rocket launcher as well. For anyone who doesn't know what they are, if you've ever seen a modern-day war movie or you've played Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, they're the big things that you lock onto a tank with, and then you hear the big buzz, and then the missile just flies out, hovers in the air slightly, and then just zooms off for the tank. Really effective. Stinger missiles, anyone who's played Metal Gear Solid will know what they are. They were infamous in Afghanistan for taking down Russian
Sorry, were you describing the homing missiles before?
Yeah.
Can I say just a fun fact there? In America, if you try to even do anything remotely at an experimentation level to reprocure a homing missile, they will just come, snatch everything, they won't elaborate, and they leave.
I mean, they've got some pretty good technology, so that does make sense.
yeah, it's completely, even for science projects and stuff, it's completely banned. And I learned that completely randomly.
Yeah, I can believe that. Just to finish off, they want to prevent the Russia. All of these were mainly infantry upgrades with things like the Chieftain, armored transports, BMPs, and anti-air capability in order to allow them to prevent the Russians from reaching Kyiv and making the invasion costly. We've already said that. Poor Russian tactics were also a big factor in it not working. Biden quoted as saying he doesn't want to encourage or enable Ukraine to strike its borders, it referring to Russia. This was to prevent the war, as said before, from spilling into Europe and decrease, the tensions with the Russians. I mean, that went well. Other things as well were given APCs, like the British Chieftain already mentioned, artillery, stockpiles of ammunition, electronic warfare, at times just checks and money. Tanks at the time were still being debated, and the no-fly zone, which was ruled out entirely, and that is still ruled out. That is still ruled out. However, the situation has actually deteriorated for the Ukrainian army, which is tragic. In relation to the invasion, I do think the Russians are in the wrong with this invasion, with how they've conducted it. And that you can't just go around doing things like this. Ukraine has to hold. The situation, like I said, when we talked about Zelensky's appeal, I do agree with him. He does need these tanks. There's been a lot of recent gains by the Wagner Group. 2 mining towns have been occupied. They need to get them out of there because they're not going to give them up. The Wagner PMC, they've got mining operations all around the world. I think they've got a few in Africa. So this is kind of their MO. So they're going to stick on those mining towns. And that's going to cause some tension between them and the Russian government. You've got Bakhmut getting encircled, along with the recent gains by the Russian army. The winter conditions actually stalled the Ukrainian offensive. We touched on this in the last podcast. The tanks were BMP transports were struggling to move through forestry areas, which was allowing the Russians to pick them off with drones. The Ukrainian army are taking heavy casualties and not getting reinforced in some places. There's already a lot of viral videos of Ukrainian platoons reduced to 3 soldiers complaining and saying they haven't been reinforced in like a month, and they're expected to hold down half a mile or something with 3 guys. So the Ukrainians, tragically, it is taking a toll on them. The steam's running out. Also, despite some of the mainstream media's propaganda, the Wagner Group I think we touched on this last podcast as well, the Wagner Group using better tactics combined with the extra troops from the mobilization. They weren't very well trained, but the way they've used them, it was ugly, and there was a lot of casualties, but it's been effective with the gains Wagner have made. It's one of the few victories of the Russian on the Russian side. However, it does need to be said that there have been some war crimes committed here. For example, there's evidence of a minefield with lots of dead bodies, and it looks suspiciously like Wagner got loads of soldiers from the prisons and just marched them into a minefield to clear it.
Yep.
It's disgusting, but sadly it's effective. There's also a potential second mobilization. How many people from the prisons will join Wagner? Now it's gotten around that the survival rate's really low, I don't know. But if there is a second mobilization of soldiers, and if they're used as effectively, that could be bad news for Ukraine without these tanks, which is why for the spring offensive, they need to break these lines and get them out. So in terms of attrition, the Ukrainians can't hold out forever, so they do need an upgrade to get them out of the current situation, hence why the German Leopard has been chosen to go in to try and update them.
But there's also the challenge of how you get these there and who is going to use them, and because just providing the ammunition and the weapons and the tanks is not the only is not the only thing that's needed for them to hold out. All I'm trying to say.
I know. Yeah, I'm fully aware. I've got a section in this that we'll be touching on that, about how effective this decision will actually be without other things.
In general, sometimes when you have a problem, you can't just keep throwing money at it and expect it to solve itself. That's again another different topic, but all I'm just trying to illustrate is that all these things from the one side, they're worrying because everyone is chipping in a little bit and it feels like World War III. At the same time, though, how effective this help is going to be and what difference it's going to make is again debatable and very difficult to predict.
Yep. I mean, I wouldn't worry about things not being relevant and being a podcast in itself. There are lots of points that can be made that are relevant here, but they could be a subtopic in themselves. It's one of the, just from my masters, it's one of the fun topics of discussing foreign policy.
True. Yeah.
And one of the fun challenges of it. The next section I had was, why was pressure needed to make Germany actually donate these tanks after quite a wait, and also to allow the export of them? We've already touched on that briefly. I'll just see if there's anything we missed. Just let us know if there's anything we've missed, because there's more detail here. So, for example, after World War II, they've always been reluctant to take offensive action. They favoured defence and working with NATO partners when they commit to offence like troops in Afghanistan. There is also the added factor of German aggression towards Russia, bearing the reminder of Stalingrad and wanting to leave that image or be open to Russian accusations of being the Nazis. Now, I have got a counterclaim to that, so don't worry, Jim, you'll get your chance to tear into that. I'm just going to end it with this one, and then you can tear into that one. A Ukrainian official claimed Ukraine had it worse than the Russians during World War II. For me, this isn't really the way to justify intervention. The fact is, it's not 1939 anymore. Germany is not the Nazi war machine, and Russia is not a member of the Allies. It's a different era, different boundaries, and with the Ukraine a new country. So that's the line of argument that should have been put forward. What do you think?
Yeah, you cannot bring events of the past to justify events of the future, because we had 2 world wars. And if you recognize that, you need to have the brains to act accordingly. Cannot bring events of the past that, oh, we had it worse in World War One or World War Two or whatever, therefore we are justified to be arrogant dicks and do whatever the fuck we want. And that doesn't go towards only Ukraine, that goes in general. Because supposedly over the last 100 years, apart from our various technological achievements, we should also be supposed a lot more matured, a lot more educated. You know, how many posts on Twitter we see about political correctness, inclusiveness, and whatnot. So just saying and regressing to that statement that, oh, we had it worse, so we deserve X, Y, Z. It's like, no, it's just not how it works.
I also want to call out another aspect of what the Ukrainians said as well, just to reverse engineer that, saying that Ukraine had it worse than Russia during World War II. Again, it's a different era. The Russia of today was not the Russia of 1939 to 45, and no one had fun in World War II. In that, do you know what I mean? The Russians got hammered. What was Ukraine back then as well? No one had fun. You shouldn't be thinking like that. The Russians of 1939 to 45 do not deserve to be held to the standard of Putin.
Also, how the hell are you
Russian civilians, sorry.
How the hell is anyone in a position to compare two different situations that they weren't even alive to experience? But even if they were, considering that each person perceives could perceive the same situation completely different because each person has a completely different perspective. How the hell do you go out and compare these two equal shit? Because as you mentioned, no one had fun in World War II. Like, how do you go and compare these two different scenarios, situations? It's beyond me. The fact that you go out and say this, it's offensive on its own, I believe, in my personal opinion.
It's distasteful. Yeah, it is. I agree with you. What the Ukrainians are doing is they're using the same tactics as Russia, more or less, to try and pressure the Germans to donate the tanks to them, to give them the tanks. The Russians are calling them the Nazis, and the Ukrainians are like, no, you're not Nazis, but they're still using that word. The word shouldn't be used by an ally, because this is not, again, it's not the Nazi war machine. But just to clarify what I was saying, the Russian civilian of 1939 to 45 doesn't deserve to be held to Putin's standard because it was a different era. And let's not forget that it was the Russians who provided a lot of manpower, as did many countries. But the Russians took huge casualties fighting the Nazi war machine, including Ukrainians. So I just find it a distasteful comment that's not relevant to this era. And I think Zelensky wants to start talking to his ministers and his officials about how they conduct themselves on air to be more, in relation to their public relations. I get that they're desperate, and I'm fully on this guy's side, but I don't agree with that. He'd be much better off saying, what we said. It's a different era, so just give us the damn weapons, because it's not the same as 1939. I've had more respect for that line of argument. I just found it distasteful, that's all.
It really was, but at the same time, we know what position they're in. They know what position they're in. They are exploiting it.
Yeah.
We know that they're exploiting it. Exploiting it. But at the same time, give them, a pass because, but they're being invaded. It's okay. But at the same time, they're being, it's not, I guess, Zelensky's being more, and his government, his officials, they're being more absurd by the minute.
Well, it's desperation as well, and it's the danger, the desperation. I can fully understand why they would want a full NATO army, boots on the ground and all, in Ukraine to fight off the Russians. I can fully understand that. With what the Russians are doing, they'll be seeing in the short term, we just need them out the country. The problem is, when the consequence of that is World War III, you have to toe the line, and it creates a horrible situation. There will be people in Ukraine sitting in their houses praying that a NATO army comes in, and they have my full empathy. It's not going to happen because of the consequences of what could happen if we do. By NATO coming in, I mean boots on the ground, soldiers, jets, AC-130s, all that.
full on invasion, basically.
Yeah.
Military level.
And I think I am willing to give Ukrainians, the Ukrainian government, the benefit of the doubt that this is just desperation. When Zelensky doesn't try and invoke NATO articles saying like, Russian troops are moving through Poland, which puts Poland in a difficult position. He does make concrete arguments why he does need more support, like the speech he made about time being a weapon favoring the Russians. He's right about that.
That is true.
But yeah, that was just an odd one I thought I'd mention. The German government's most likely also worried about its re-election. When I checked, the population wasn't that favourable to increasing intervention in the conflict. I think it's become a bit more popular now, but they'll be concerned about it. Remember, German living standards haven't fallen as far as the UK's, so the German population might not be as hostile to actual spending abroad, but apparently they're moving on from this culture. And the idea of, I don't know about intervention so much in Ukraine specifically, but the idea of defense is being favored by them, and some reinvestment in the military. Probably in reaction to what's going on in Ukraine, but my understanding is that the actual intervention in Ukraine is quite unpopular still. So they might be worried about intervention in the conflict, which would explain the low numbers of tanks. For example, just what we were saying as well about the army and its NATO requirements. The German army's been underfunded for a long time. Kind of hardware invention will require a financial investment. Germany's already increased its spending to 2% of their GDP. And like I said, just what we were saying earlier about his speech going away from the norm. So we've already covered that. So the next section would be what led to the authorization, what directly led to authorizing the tanks. We've already touched on that. It was Britain did open the door for it, and then you had the US donating the 31 Abrams, then Poland saying they were just going to do it. Then after that, the Germans decided to export the license. Zelensky had his speech.
Yeah, it's just a chain of events which we briefly touched, I think, on every single one of them.
Mm-hmm.
More or less, at least.
Yep. The only thing I would really...
Yeah, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, the only thing I would really add to this section that we more or less got out of the way at the beginning, because you were right on the ball there, the small numbers are from a pool of about 2,000 leopards across 13 countries. That's why the leopard has really been chosen, because there's absolutely shitloads of them in existence.
They are a bit outdated. They are a bit outdated as well, right?
Depends which model. The A4 absolutely is, and that seems to be the majority of the ones that are getting sent. So they are getting sent the 80s variant, the A4. The A6 is from the early 2000s, and the A7 is the latest gen. So it's not standardized, and they're not all A7s. And that's one of the things we'll get into, actually, the lack of standardization in the Leopard. Not all of them are as good as the A7. For example, the A7 has automated turrets and things like that. So they're only getting a handful of them. They're also... getting it along with this, they're getting more artillery as well to actually try and support the armor. So it's really clear they're preparing for this spring offensive. The only thing I had added to this is what we were saying earlier. If this is just a prediction, by the way, it's not even a prediction, just an opinion of what might happen. Quantity over quality. While the tanks might be good against, being outnumbered 1-2, they're going to get a lot more than that. Like 15 Leopards taking on like 40 T-80s or T-72s. From the Russians. That's overwhelming firepower, not to mention you're dealing with experienced crews, which we'll get into actually this a bit later. You're dealing with experienced Russian soldiers with their anti-tank weapons, with air support. It could become a vehicle grinder very quickly, and if you're talking about Germany sending in another 50 and Poland another 100 and whatnot, I mean, I can't remember if it was another 100, but if you're talking about another 100 tanks going in again from a handful of countries, then you're talking about a natural flow of vehicles constantly going into this war in droplets at a time. Which arms companies will make money from. It'll become a vehicle grinder.
Yeah, most likely.
Yep. So now we get into what you were saying about ammunition, the state of Ukrainian tanks. I mean, that there is a need to modernize the Ukrainian military and put it on the NATO standard, including the tanks, because the Ukraine is dependent on NATO for supplies, as they were dependent on Russia for their military supplies before this. And they also lack a large amount, of production facilities to make their own ammo and vehicles. They had some of they started developing it, and it's only until very recently they had it. But those workshops are on the move because obviously the Russians would just bomb them. Without supply, everything they have is finite. It's only very recently they developed some production facilities of their own, but to put it bluntly, before the war and consequently during, they don't have their own arms industry.
I mean, I would be very surprised if they did, because supposing in a scenario where the Russians hadn't blown up their ammunition factories, the energy crisis affects massively production of
Oh yeah.
ammunition.
Well, the
Because
Russian. Go on.
yeah, because you need resources to produce ammunition. I mean,
Mm.
to
Yeah.
put it very, very simply, if I have trouble paying bills to keep my house warm, imagine the factories producing ammunitions. I mean, sure, they get, you know, they get to increase the prices and have more profit, but I'm saying that they're probably hit as well.
Oh yeah. Add to that as well, anything that even looks like a factory, the Russians have bombed. They've also bombed energy plants, which is also a danger because they bombed a nuclear one or danger close to a nuclear one. So yeah, they are going after infrastructure to cut the nuts off any potential arms industry that the Ukrainians might develop for the war, which gets into the British government actually wanting to put a factory on the Polish border. Because you can already get ammunition and things in from Poland, and the Russians can't attack the factories there. But the British government wants to build another factory and workshop, tank repair and whatnot, on the Polish border, very close to Ukraine.
And who is going to work there?
I imagine it would be the Polish workers.
And will the UK have at least some sort of profit of it, or is it going to be a money sink?
Honestly, there's not really a lot of information that's gotten out about this.
Mm.
I imagine it's just giving money to Poland to build something. But just as well, what we were saying before this, most of the Ukrainian tanks, if not all, were of Soviet era. They completely lacked modern technologies like electronic warfare capability to combat the Russians effectively. They do need a more modern tank. Also, the downside of them being mostly Soviet era, NATO didn't really have a lot of Soviet era tanks, and they don't have a lot of Soviet era ammunition. In fact, the supplies of both are starting to run out. I know places like Lithuania scrapped most of their Soviet era tanks a long time ago. They just didn't keep them, so that there's not really a lot of supplies. Not only that, the ammunition is more. The Soviet era ammunition is very difficult to procure. So it was really essential to standardize the Ukrainians on the NATO standard, to give them artillery guns, tanks, basically any vehicle that requires Soviet ammunition or gun that requires Soviet ammunition, give them the NATO equivalent. That way we can just pour thousands of NATO rounds to them because we already have that supply, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's
A really big consequence of this, the Ukrainians had, apparently it's something like 1,000 tanks. Although that's a big number, it's potentially they had like 1,000 tanks, and a large chunk of them basically just went to ruin because they lacked the spare parts, because again they were dependent on Russia, but without the spare parts they couldn't maintain them. For example, every time a tank fires its gun, it strains the actual machinery, so it does need to be maintained eventually. So they couldn't really supply them, and it was getting harder and harder to actually give them spare parts. Poland and other countries supplied them with 200 plus T-72s, but just on a side note, a really effective tank to give the Ukrainians would be the Polish PT-21, because it's basically an upgrade of the T-72 for a more modern era, and they'd be able to integrate it straight away because they'd already be trained on it, because it's so similar to the Soviet era tanks. So that would be a good one to give them. But even providing the PT-21s, it's still delaying the inevitable. I'm not sure if this is so much this is going to be a horrible thing to say. I'm not sure this is so much an escalation as it is just a modernizing of the Ukrainian military, if that makes sense. Basically getting them off Soviet era. But again, in terms of arms company and the war economy, look at what's happening. They're no longer dependent on Russia for manufacturing and weapons, so it's no more money in their economy. Now they're going to be dependent on NATO for ammunition. Now at the minute it's getting donated, but if Ukraine manages to push Russia out, then I imagine it won't be free anymore.
Well, like I told you, this whole "Let's help Ukraine," I believe, is being seen as more of an investment rather than charity.
Oh yeah.
So they will at some point they will expect to have a return in profit, one way or another.
Oh yeah, it's not the first time. When the US invaded Grenada, there's a running joke. Was it about nutmeg, or was it because the US president saw a Russian APC in the Grenada military? I know I shouldn't say that, but that was the running joke on it.
Yeah.
Also, heavy losses. The Ukrainian military has stated that the Ukrainians have lost one half of its heavy weapons, and 400 tanks rather are unusable. The 500 captured tanks, remember when they were forever stealing Russian tanks? Just to put the legend to bed and get to the truth of it, what's come out now is most of them had taken quite a bit of damage, so only a handful could actually be reused. The rest were harvested for spare parts. And what I was saying earlier, with the upgrades like the N7s added to what they currently had before the Leopards were going in, previous to this, though outnumbered, a combination of precise strikes on both supply depots and command posts allowed Ukrainians to put pressure on occupied territory and degrade the ability of the Russians to fire shells at defense lines. Modern tanks may make this easier also, but they really need to break through. They can't allow a second mobilization to gather troops at those lines and come at them like Wagner did very recently and before Christmas. And I just had more really about the situation of the front lines for Ukraine being quite dire. But I think we've already explained why they need the armor to break through these lines earlier in the podcast.
Yep.
So the next section, is this a combination of political gesture and just maintaining the level of support to be as minimal as possible to stop Ukraine from losing over actually allowing them to get an actual victory over Russia?
Say it again.
Oh, is this just a combination of a political gesture and what Joe Biden said to make sure that they can survive, and I'll rephrase, potentially push Russia out, but to make sure they can't invade Russia?
Yeah, I would say so.
I would say so, because the numbers are too low. For example, this is where we'll get into some fun combat details. With the current numbers, I think I've said before, 88, you need about 100 for a battalion. So having 88, but then you've got the Bradleys and the Challengers, so over 100 so far. There aren't really enough being sent to make a difference. It's estimated about 88 will be sent in a combination of different Leopard 2 models. Challenger 2s and Abrams will go along with that, along with dozens of Bradleys and Marders and AMXs and things. It'll be formidable, and it'll certainly break through the lines in the short term, but as it takes casualties and vehicles are lost, the fighting effectiveness will deteriorate, and it will eventually give out it might actually give out after a few battles. Individually, the tanks are superior to Russian tanks, but like I was saying before, there's a quantity over quality. The last thing that they need to happen is for Russian waves to wear them down, with just overwhelming numbers. And furthermore, what you have as well, you've got the experience of the Russian crews in their T-72s over the crews in the Leopards with the lack of experience operating them. Unless NATO's smuggling in NATO crews who've operated them for years. Or unless the Ukrainians have been trained in them secretly for years. But you'll have more experienced tank crews in a tank they know taking on an advanced tank with a crew that's very new on it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so basically to summarize, it's the case that they're sending help, not enough help to pose a great threat to Russia, but just enough to appear that they're actually doing something and have enough of a leverage afterwards, even when Ukraine wins, to say, hey, we helped you, we need something back now. And it's also the case, well, it's not the case, but it's more about debating how effective this help will be, because you send all these different vehicles, but you also need proper crew to operate them.
Yeah.
And the crew not only to operate them, but even maintaining them, because, as you mentioned earlier, if you use them too much, they wear out.
Yep.
And I'm not even sure what happens with the different weather conditions. Like if you have extreme cold and stuff, would that affect their operability? I don't know.
I'm not
But,
sure about
yeah.
weather conditions.
Yeah, like in extreme cold or extreme heat, I don't know. But then it is Ukraine, so you wouldn't have extreme heat. I don't know. Sorry, I was just blabbering.
No, it's fine. No, it's unfortunately you've caught me out here. I've tried to be the smartest guy in the room by having all the facts, but I don't actually know what weather conditions can do to tank maintenance. I'm sure it can wear them out, but I'm guessing.
Yeah, because in extreme heat, the metal sort of expands, which is why, for example, in train. The metal beams are not completely one next to another. They always have some sort of centimeters of gap for that reason, because in summer when it expands, that gap closes, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I'm sure that the Ukrainians getting trained on the Leopards and will be trained on how to deal with weather conditions affecting the tank, to be honest. And I would have thought that Ukrainians would know how to maintain tanks in their own country in relation to the weather conditions. So it's probably not
but
a concern.
Would that apply to the ones they would receiving now? Because they're a bit different, somewhere at least.
On that note, this is in this section. That's a good point, because the Abrams and the Challenger 2 are a bit different to the Leopard, and the Leopard itself is a bit different. But we will get to that. Just quickly, if that's okay, because that's coming up next, just after this section. I was just going to say, the use of these tanks, it won't be like Iraq, where you had Bradleys knocking out T-72s with their TOW missiles, and Abrams and Challengers that were almost unstoppable. Ukraine doesn't have the airspace. All of these modern tanks have never been used before in a theatre where the enemy has more firepower and air superiority. So this is an entirely new situation for them. And let's be honest here. The Ukrainians don't have any airspace of their own. War is combined arms. People who say, "Oh, tanks are becoming irrelevant now," it's not so much they're irrelevant. Any unit on its own without the adequate support will get picked off. If you're going to say that about tanks, then you can say that about infantry. You can say that about helicopters. You can say that about planes. If
Well,
you know what I mean.
if you do, it's not how big your weapon is.